Well, Bill, we're in your neck of the woods here, north of the border.
My hometown too.
This is your hometown.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Canary is over
I'm in Vancouver, but
Vancouver.
But most of the staff is in Carlsbad,
and
California.
Local.
Yeah.
Local. And you were just sharing before we went on tape that you put yourself through med school.
Working at Labatt's just up the road here.
Labatt's.
Yeah. I managed to convince him. I worked on the line for the first few years, but I managed to convince him when I got my bachelor's degree that they could put me in the lab. Not a word of a lie. I worked in the brew house, and when I became a doctor, I actually had to take a pay cut. That's how well that the brew house paid.
Wow. Well, lucky us. We made it to where we are today. Yeah, and you know, last time you and I chatted, I think it was last year at Biomet, if I'm not mistaken, and you had some new technologies sort of percolating, and I think you just released a few new products this past week, maybe.
Yep, last week, yeah.
So bring us up to speed on it.
Sure, so it's amazing. There's almost an equivalent of Moore's Law when it comes to batteries, which is that every couple of years they get double the power density and they decrease in size. So when we launched our knee, this was the 58 millimeter stem. It was the largest, it was the smallest we could make it. And this is the one we have now. And so it's 30 millimeters. It's as small as the shortest stem that Zimmer makes, right? So you can see what a difference that makes. And we kind of can't make them fast enough. People are really excited to have this.
Why is that important? Obviously, size matters inversely in this case. Why is that so important on that size reduction to the clinician and the patient?
For a really big patient, I don't think it matters. But if you think about how this goes in, where they drill in and they have to put in, you worry about the tip of that hitting the cortex of the bone. And so the smaller it is, the smaller patients it can go in. We were probably losing 25-30% of patients because our stem was on the long side. So someone like you and I, that was great, but for a small woman, this was not an option. That, like I said, has as much power as the big stem, and it is, the smallest stem that Zimmer makes. So we're really in every possible patient now, and I think there are a decent number of folks who are saying, I'm going to wait until I have the small stem, because if I'm going to put it in everybody, then I want to have the option of putting it in everybody, which wasn't necessarily the case when the long stem.
So you mentioned Zimmer because you're in partnership with Zimmer on this, right? Are they the first implant to put an active sensor inside of a knee?
In a commercial sense, I think there's been some R&D stuff that was done a number of years ago, but as a true commercial rollout, this is kind of the first of its kind.
And I love to see that. Prepping for a panel, I don't think you can make it at Mayo, where they're talking about embedded sensors in the devices in order to track performance, and the important that, although you and I have discussed this, some device companies may not want to have the performance or lack thereof in their devices.
There's kind of a dichotomy, I guess, in this sense, and we'll come back to the knee. I think there's a real genuine interest because the patients want to know about their recovery, and the doctors want to know about the patient's kinematics and function. It's pretty essential to how they view recovery following TKA. But the one I kind of always pick on is the breast implant manufacturers. It's really easy to make a censored breast implant. And that can tell you whether or not it's leaking, whether or not it's encapsulated, whether or not a mass is pushing against the implant. And, a lot of women choose not to have those implants for safety reasons. So, but not everybody wants to know what their leakage rate is or what the failure rate is. That's not universal, but it's in that particular instance, it was way more of an uphill climb. In other instances, in cardiovascular disease, knowing whether your aneurysm leaks or not, or knowing whether your coronary stent is open or closed, these are no-brainers, and people are very interested in that. But in some indications, a little bit more trepidation.
And you and I were chatting about that in our last sit, where we talked about you starting to get into that
Yep.
cardiovascular space. What kind of progress have you made there?
That's probably the most exciting thing we're working on. We use the IMU similar to this in the sense that we have, all the activity metrics, so, step count, cadence, distance traveled, walking speed, all that, which is important in a cardiovascular patient because you can tell if they're active or not. And we can tell their orientation, which is also important. Are they sleeping flat or are they having to sleep upright? But we've added to that both ECG and very high fidelity acoustics. And so what that allows you to do is not just monitor rhythm, but the first thing you learn in med school is to put a stethoscope on a chest. And so you can listen to the heart valves and you can tell, from the murmur, whether it's a grade 1, 2, or 3, all of that. You can hear the lungs, so you can tell the fluid balance of the patient. But probably the most exciting part is the splitting of S2, which I could never hear, but the splitting of S2 is directly proportional to pulmonary artery pressure. And because we have both ECG and high fidelity microphone, we can measure that to the millisecond. And that means that we can quantify precisely what pulmonary artery pressure is. And we can do that all superficially from a sub-Q implant that's put in the office. Right now, that all has to be done with a sensor placed right into the pulmonary artery. And we've done all the big animal studies, we've done our first in man studies. The data's incredible.
Wow.
So that's really exciting for us.
So, a sub-Q placement, and also, obviously for somebody who already has had an indication of, or a previous event, creating that baseline, seeing degradation of signal, right?
Well, Endotronics, CardioMEMS, these devices
But
were
those are fully
all designed.
implantable.
Right. They were all designed to, use pulmonary artery pressure as an indicator of congestive heart failure and cardiac monitoring. So to be able to do it, in an office-based sub-Q, non-blood contacting way is, potentially quite a step forward. So
that's a substantial, given the pursuit right now of heart failure, diagnostics, therapeutics, and becoming an unlock there.
Yep.
So what does that pathway look like, if you can share it?
Yeah, early this probably 2025, we'll do a larger human study to get us to, the ultimate approval study. I think it will really just be putting these in people who already have an invasive monitor in and making sure that we're able to do exactly, what the invasive monitor is able to do and that it matches up quite well. This is something you can simulate very well in animal models, so we're pretty encouraged by the data.
I was going to say, it's not much of a stretch.
No.
Given the data you're monitoring and.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we already know from putting them in a couple of patients in South America that it all works. And again, we built all the analytics background. It turns out to be quite an exercise in noise filtering. The human body is a very noisy place, and so you have to figure out what each of these sounds means. But by putting a microphone under the skin, it's about 10 times more greater fidelity than having it on the surface of the skin.
Sure.
And plus, you have consistent anatomy day after day, and the patient acts as their own control because you're comparing their data hour by hour, day by day. So you're able to follow these people continuously for years. And unlike the knee, we can replace the battery if we need to. We don't.
Right.
With the knee, once it goes in, that's all we got. But here we have the ability to use more power and to monitor continuously.
So you started with this sensor technology in orthopedics, and now have migrated to cardiovascular. So it's a big problem set. Where else could this be potentially the basis of Canary and the technology you've built? Where else can this migrate to in the industry?
Yeah, so even within orthopedics, we're already moving outward. We're working with Zimmer on hips and shoulders as well. We're working on cementless knees. That prosthesis is a cemented knee. And as I know, there's a big movement towards uncemented prostheses, and so we're working on all of those. We're actually working with a few doctors on using this for ACL repairs to look at stability of the joint. That's more of a tibial implant, then it doesn't look like this, but the same type of things. Foot and ankle, trauma, all these things require that. And then last but not least, we did get breakthrough status on the spine. So we're working on putting these inside intervertebral cages to monitor fusion, monitor patient activity, monitor subsidence, movement of the implant.
That's a hornet's nest.
It really is. Yeah, that's a whole different discussion. Yep.
That's a hornet's nest.
Yep.
To say the least, on the spine.
Yes.
Yeah. So, if you don't mind digging into it a little bit, I try and be sort of an outlet to the industry for the trends that are happening, not just in devices, but also in business models.
Yep.
And we've watched these fabulous build-to-buy models starting to emerge that sort of got their legs in biotech and now are moving into medtech.
Yep.
We're watching these co-investments made by the big strategics into standalone organizations like Canary, like Proximy, like that bring a technology to a market, and the symbiotic relationships is a little oversized. The big strategic is Samson, right? And then the smaller player who's bringing that fringe technology in order to empower their core technology. What are those dynamics like as a CEO, if you can share it?
Yeah, when I was younger and running Angiotech, Hank McKinnell, who was CEO of Pfizer at the time, was on my board. And was a very influential figure in my career. And he used to say, it's an elephant dancing with a mouse. And never forget which one of you is the mouse. And I think that pretty much sums it up. You have to be both helpful and stay out of the way at times, but you also have to assert yourself, when needed.
Yeah.
But it is very difficult. My wife says it's like trying to turn an aircraft carrier with one of those little paddle boats. It's a difficult thing to do. But at Angiotech, we built the first drug code sense with Boston Scientific. I believe at their peak revenue, we were something like 70% of their revenue at that point in time. The Texas franchise was. So it was interesting to see how that technology grew to have legitimate influence in how the company was run. But when you first start out, you really don't have that influence because the technology hasn't borne out, and your influence only grows with sales, no matter how much you would like it to be otherwise.
That's right. And I've seen that before. I've seen it where the big strategic is bringing in a technology that either enhances or cannibalizes the existing market that they have.
Right.
And we're starting to see that a lot right now with robotics, where the big strategics are investing in robotics companies, at the same time trying to run their own internal program. That kind of a disruptive technology, I'm on the record, you just can't do it in a big strategics. There's just not enough fringe behavior that's permitted in the big strategic. And so it's got to come from innovators like you who stand there, and to your point, I love the visual of the elephant with the mouse. Just don't get under its foot at the wrong time.
It's fatal if you do.
Because you're making bets and they're making bets. But your bet tends to be a little more terminal in nature than theirs.
It does. It's funny, we were talking beforehand, but the business strategists call it organ rejection. And it's the targeted immune response that an external technology brings to a big organization. And there's a heavy inertia towards status quo, and if you come in with something that's kind of disruptive to internal programs, that can elicit a fairly aggressive counter push. There's countless books written on this, but probably the best example was when IBM decided to make the first laptop. They actually took a group, moved them to Florida. They weren't allowed to use any internal IBM resources because they knew that the mainframe business, which paid all the bills, would not look kindly on this. And they set up an entirely different corporation to do that and bring the IBM laptop to life. And many companies choose to do that type of model where they isolate it either actually or figuratively, but they give the group that's working on it autonomy, independent of the big organization, because what's right for that business may very well not be right for this business.
That's right, and we're seeing more and more of that. I've had discussions around that governance. It's the importance of governance, of bringing that in. And you mention it, and it's terrible. I'm saying it, you're not. It's because it puts careers at risk.
Right.
When I'm bringing in a laptop to an IBM, and Fred's on the AS400 platform.
That's right.
Fred's probably out of a job, and Fred's not on that meteoric rising platform that's getting all the attention.
Yep.
And so I think the large strategics love the technology broadly, but there are stakeholders who have their Mercedes car payment, their private school payment, and their identity in a 25-year career at risk, and unconsciously maybe taking a shot at that.
Right.
That's me saying that, that's not you.
Well, I never went to business school, but I read all the disruptive business theory books, Christensen's work, and the innovator's dilemma outlines the problem of innovating within large organizations. The innovator's solution discusses how to address it, and one of the first things they say is you're going to have to take this organism and segregate it, and if you don't compensate it separately, if you don't give it its own budget and its own autonomy and the ability to make decisions that may very well be, in contrast to the decision that would be made in the bigger organization, it's going to be more difficult to make it work.
Yeah, and it's already hard enough to take a fringe technology and make it successful without having snipers on the side right here, literally or figuratively, trying to take it out.
Yeah, and I mean, our business model here involves bringing a novel technology into an existing, usually very successful franchise.
Right.
And it has been fascinating, because this isn't about Zimmer, it isn't about anything. It's really just about bringing this and trying to take a device and turn it into a smart, contributory device. And I always say to people, we spend all this money on robotics, AR, VR. Our surgeons are putting things in with a micrometer. And then we put in a plain metal device, and we follow up by usually with a questionnaire or imaging. And so we've got all this digital input, and then we have complete analog output. And one of my beliefs about why robotics has, in orthopedics, for example, not shown improvements in outcomes, I think it's actually a very good technology. I think it really does make a difference. But we're putting it in with a micrometer and we're measuring it with a sextant, right? I mean, we have absolutely no idea. And until the feedback is digital and precise and down to micrometers, you're never going to have enough to guide the procedures to get the outcomes that you actually want. So I think this is a no-brainer. I think this ultimately happens, but it involves bringing much like robotics, it involves bringing an entirely different technology into an existing franchise.
And it's incumbent upon leaders like Yvonne at Zimmer to continue to push that forward at all costs.
Yep. Yeah. And I'm going to give a shout out to Yvonne. I mean, this program I don't think would have gotten as far if it hadn't been for his push. Like he was committed to it. He's really put his shoulder behind the wheel and moved it forward and helped us assimilate into the organization. So
yeah, it's good to see leaders like Yvonne doing that and pushing that, especially in the ortho space. Well, always appreciate our time. Thanks for hosting Biomet in your backyard.
Yeah, well, it means I got to go pay for dinner for the family tonight. So.
Well, I'm going to go have a Labatt's on you if you still make it. I appreciate the time.
Thanks.
I'm Joe Mullings from the floor of Biomet Conference in Toronto. Be well.